Hello and good afternoon. We've got people dialing in this afternoon to our webinar for the Energy Communities Alliance on emergency preparedness and consolidated storage. We'll talk about a little bit more than that today, but that it was really the impetus for this webinar. We recognize that there are a lot of communities that are starting to think about the options around consolidated storage of commercial spent fuel, and we wanted to make sure that they were thinking about emergency preparedness early in that process. And really, I think a lot of the lessons that our panelists are bringing today are really applicable to a whole range of nuclear facilities. So we'll talk about a variety of things today. My name is Laura Hermann. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Energy Communities Alliance, and I am joined today with some fantastic uh, experts on this topic. And with us, we have Chief Mike Cochran from Craig, Colorado. He has nearly 40 years of law enforcement service and has been the police chief in Craig, Colorado since 2021, coming into that office after really being in the Colorado area and serving not only with the police department, but also doing a few years of work as the emergency management coordinator for the sheriff's department in Moffat County. So he brings that experience to our discussion today and is able to kind of speak also to some of his experience in law enforcement in his native home of Georgia and his adopted home of Craig, Colorado. So it's great to have Chief Mike here today. We also have Lee Perlis from Virginia, and she is the fusion director at the Virginia Department of Health. Lee was previously the director of the Office of Radiological Health and has 30 years of experience in public health and MPH, and I think is a really interesting addition to our conversation today in light of the announcement in 2024 that Commonwealth Fusion Systems would be building a commercial fusion power plant in Chesterfield, Virginia. So in addition to having operating fission plants, Virginia is also trying to figure out what this outlook for emergency preparedness and regulation looks like for fusion as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We also have our board member from ECA and county councilor from Los Alamos, Randall Wrighty. He's been in Los Alamos for decades as a small business owner and then as an elected official. He has a science background by education and by profession, and has volunteered for a variety of community organizations looking at environmental education and the Science Fair Committee for the Los Alamos County District. And he has also served on the Los Alamos County Transportation Board for 4 years. And so brings perspective on what it's like to live and work in conjunction with one of the national lab sites and the facilities there in the state of New Mexico. And then finally, last but not least, we have Brian Scroggins from the state of Nevada. And he also, like all of our panelists, has an extensive background in emergency management and preparation. Being in the Nevada area, he's had some really tremendous personal experiences with command efforts and recovery efforts after mass shootings, in addition to some of the large-scale events that are prepared for in the Las Vegas region. He's a national speaker on recovery efforts and a graduate of the FEMA Executive and Advanced Academies, and serves on the Clark County, Nevada Multi-Agency Coordination Center. And so that group organizes events and volunteers for preparedness around things like the Super Bowl, the Grand Prix, F1 races, those types of things. So I'm really grateful to all of these folks for spending time with us today and helping us tee up this conversation for our membership, recognizing that this is all about preparedness, and we hope that these things aren't necessary. Expect that the industry is doing a good job making them unnecessary, but realizing that preparation is really key to success in the implementation of all of these complex technologies. I want to give everybody a couple minutes to introduce yourselves and your perspective on these issues. And if we start with you, Chief Cochran.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Laura alluded to, I'm Mike Cochran. I'm the Chief of Police in Craig, Colorado. For those of you that are not familiar, we're in the northwest corner of the state between between Wyoming and Utah. Pretty remote area, and we have just started or had discussions on the topic of a potential storage facility in the community. Very interesting information. Again, been in law enforcement for 30, going on 37 years, so quite a time. Have enjoyed the time here and just happy to be with each of you.
Great, thank you. Lee, how would you take us from here?
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Lee Perlis, and I'm currently the Fusion Director for the Virginia Department of Health within the Population Health and Preparedness Group. Previously, the Office Director for RAD Health, so I participated in a lot of fission preparation, trying to cross that over now as we look at what preparedness around fusion looks like. It's such a new technology in terms of commercialization. So we are hitting the ground running and looking at what we can adapt over from fission into fusion and what we need to tweak and change with that. But I really appreciate you having me.
Thanks. Randall, we'll just go around in alphabetical order again before we
Okay.
kick it off.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, and thanks for Energy Community Alliance for organizing the webinar today and giving us all a chance to talk about our experiences with this area. So, as you said, I've lived here for quite a long time. The county has created, after the Manhattan Project, during World War II. So it makes it one of the oldest and longest operating nuclear facilities in our country. So our county council, Los Alamos County Council, is responsible for policy and funding of all government functions, which include emergency preparedness. I think the other thing that's important to highlight is that the county is relatively compact in terms of size. In the west, in particular, it's 109 square miles, with about 80% being federal land from Forest Service, Department of Energy, and National Park Service. And the other thing is that the National Laboratory here is really integrated part and parcel of the county and the community. So we have a census population of just under 20,000 people currently, but the daytime population is about 30,000 people. So there's 10,000 people that basically have to drive most every day. So this creates obvious challenges for us, and there's even more issues and when you have weather accidents or other kinds of emergency events. And since I've lived in Los Alamos County, we've been evacuated 2 times, and seems like we have fires every year, wildfires every year nearby.
Those evacuations were fire related, correct? Just to clarify.
Right, those were fire related. Yeah, just to clarify. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we had 2 large wildfires in 2000 and 2011.
Yeah, thanks. Great. And Brian.
Thank you. I appreciate joining you today. I'm coming to you, although I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, I'm coming to you from Carlsbad, New Mexico. I'm a member of the High Level Radioactive Waste Committee and the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant Technical Advisory Group on Transportation. We're actually going to go 2,000 feet below ground tomorrow at the WIP plant to check that out. But yeah, I am the administrator for the Division of Planning for the Agency for Nuclear Projects in Nevada, and my background for emergency management has come through a lot of different venues. I do have a nonprofit called the Emergency Management Foundation, where I have a national advisory board. We do projects for police and fire for behavioral health equipment needs, and again, I kind of came into the emergency management realm through the nonprofit world, overseeing various things, as you mentioned, the 1 October festival mass shooting recovery, the UNLV shooting, things like that. But I oversee transportation of radioactive waste in Nevada. We have about 150 shipments a quarter that come in through California that go out to the Nevada National Security Site. And then we also have some higher level radioactive waste that comes across the I-80 corridor up north that eventually makes its way down here to the WIP plant. So that's kind of what we do, monitor those things, make sure that people have the training that they need to deal with that. And we've been having some discussions this morning at these other meetings about how to get people equipped with the emergency preparedness training that they need in case these things come up in their own communities. So thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And thanks for distinguishing the types of waste that are being transported. And I think we'll try to do that throughout our conversation today because we recognize that there are various types and classes of radioactive waste that need to be planned for, and that sort of changes the dynamic in a lot of ways. And as we kind of continue into this conversation, I want to remind everybody that this is being recorded today. All of our webinars are, and shortly after, in the next few days, you'll be able to tune into the ECA YouTube channel and see anything in case you miss part of our conversation today. So we are recording this, and if any of our folks in the audience have questions, please use the question and answer function in Zoom to post those questions to us. I will try to incorporate into the questions that we have, and we'll save some of the questions for the end of our conversation. So with that sort of housekeeping out of the way, I want to come back to this idea, Chief Cochran, I know you were awarded a law enforcement certification from the Colorado Association of Chiefs of Police. So you've got experience with this not only from the practical day-to-day, but also looking at it from a training perspective. Like, how does emergency preparedness change when radioactive materials are involved?
Well, I appreciate the question. And I think for us in law enforcement, it doesn't change a whole lot. We reach out and some of the starting points with some of the very first classes that we have come from FEMA. There are a host of classes that most law enforcement, especially in this state, are required to have from FEMA. And they're a very good introduction to nuclear or radiological emergencies. From that, we build on with multiple places that you can find those. The state Department of Public Safety here in Colorado has classes. Public Health has classes. Centers for Radiological and Nuclear Training provide classes. And a lot of these classes are absolutely free. I know that with FEMA, you start out with some of the basic introductions, but you can build up to much more than that. You can build up to much more classes, and not to mention some of the huge agencies that offer classes and are willing to come to you for that training. We see that all over the country. I know coming from Georgia, same opportunities were there for classes from just countless places. And just a quick Google search will give you pages of different organizations that provide training for that.
Thanks. Before I go to Lee and Brian, who I think will have a different perspective on this, Randall, I want to go to you as an elected official because you already mentioned the wildfires that you've had to evacuate for. Like, how does emergency preparedness change for the county when it comes to radioactive materials?
Yeah, I think that there's at least maybe a couple different ways of looking at this. So one part is the regulatory framework. So Los Alamos National Laboratory is under the purview of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, so DNFSB. So they have hearings and meetings on different topics. And so they're intended to be both responsive to incidents that have happened and just more generally protective. And due to the nature of some of that, they're not all public meetings, but they do have meetings, and they do ask for when they have meetings, they're available to the public. We are noticed as elected officials that those are available for us to attend, and certainly we could, when there's a fully situated board, we can contact members of the board if we had concerns about how things are operating. And as I recall, there were some findings or recommendations based on the wildfire near here back in 2000. And there's also there's some of the regulatory authority is under the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and also the state of New Mexico Environment Department also regulates some things. But as I said, it's very complex because there are certain defense-related activities that are excluded, but there are also some oversight of that. So I think that from just a general public perspective, the public appreciates getting the information on what oversight there is and what planning there is. And I think people understand we don't have full transparency on the kinds of incidents they might be expecting. But there was one that just was fairly recent that wasn't necessarily an emergency, but there's certainly emergency preparedness aspect to the depressurization of the waste containers, the flange waste containers. And so there were several public meetings on that. And it's good to be aware of the kinds of issues that people have. So some people are very much non-concerned. They work with this kind of material all the time, and they understand the assumptions being made and that it's highly protective. But other members of the public were really highly concerned about, and were concerned even after the fact. So even though there were no releases reported. And then I think the other thing, so the FEMA offering training is another important thing too. So we have just routinely, so we'll get briefings on the role of elected officials in emergency, preparedness, what things we need to do before, and your blue sky day planning to communicating during an event, and just understanding what kinds of events are most likely for us, given that we have a national lab in our backyard, plus all the other things that wildfires, and you can have some flooding after those, and all that kind of thing. So
Yeah, Brian, I think you're probably the next person who has like that really wide swath. I think Chief Mike and Lee bring like very specific focal points to this issue, but I'm interested to hear from you as well from the Nevada perspective. Like how does emergency preparedness change when radioactive materials are involved?
Yeah, I agree with Chief Mike in that there's a broad spectrum of training available. I've been back to the Emergency Institute, Management Institute about 20 times. I was scheduled to be in Anniston next week for Center for Domestic Preparedness, but that's been postponed because of the government shutdown. So there's a tremendous amount of training out there. And I think all of that training is good. I guess it deals with the application of that training in a particular incident. Like with the mass shooting in Las Vegas, it was an event that happened. We responded to it. We're still recovering from that with, behavioral health and things like that, people who've been affected, and that will be ongoing. But it wasn't like a leakage of radioactive material. It wasn't a spill, of a cask on a crowded freeway. And so again, I think the application of that training, again, the 1 October shooting happened. We responded to it, but it wasn't something where we had to evacuate a community. There wasn't long-term remediation as far as cleanup efforts and things like that. So, and the track record, obviously, and I think if we had a representative from here, from the Department of Energy, they would say that the track record in transportation has been pretty good. And I would agree with that, but we're always looking at that one incident where it maybe isn't good. What happens and what happens to a community. Do you have your CBRN unit in the fire department ready to go? Do you have your hazmat unit trained and ready to go? Do you have the equipment necessary? We always prepare for the worst and hope for the best, but sometimes that worst case scenario does happen. There's a book called Worst Case Scenarios that I read recently, and again, it's pretty shocking about if you let your mind wander as to what can happen. But again, I think the radioactive element would change response to anything. A wildfire, you can evacuate. The wildfire eventually gets put out. Vegetation starts to grow again. But if something were to happen of a magnitude where you would have to evacuate an area of a city and leave it evacuated for a long term.
And Lee, from the public health perspective, how do you approach emergency preparedness when radioactive materials are involved?
So, from a public health standpoint, Virginia has worked very hard to establish relationships at the city, county, state level, working with our federal partners. We spoke about training here. And so, from a technical standpoint, there's a lot of training to be had. But also, you've got to do that community outreach, and you have to look at your stakeholders who are not the technical experts in the room. How do they communicate with the public with regards to any incident regarding radioactive materials? In Virginia, with the two power stations, those folks that live in those areas are pretty well versed after all these decades of having fission plants. But with regard to fusion being new in Chesterfield, which is just outside of Richmond, we are seeing a lot more community concern, elected official concern, looking to the Department of Health and what are we going to do and who are we going to partner with to protect the community and provide that public health aspect. So I think working with all of our partners and keeping the lines of communication open. We have a multi-agency working group that I put together that involves a lot of people, from environmental quality to energy to public health to emergency management to even labor and industry. So all of these stakeholders are on the same page because we have frequent meetings just to make sure that we're all have the same message and we're communicating the same message. It's just about letting the public know that we are there for them. We serve them. So that is our job. And I think that is very important, not to take away from the technical aspect. Obviously, we need that. And having worked in the technical aspect, I do understand that. But for me, it changes when radioactive materials are mentioned in any way because there's public concern. And so from a public health standpoint, that is a huge consideration, not just the technicality of how we're going to prepare for an emergency, how we're going to monitor the environment, but also how are we going to communicate to those that we serve?
Yeah. I'm curious, from any of you on the call today, can you describe, hospitals have radioactive materials on site as well. How does that factor into your planning efforts?
Well, for us, in a broad sense of responding to an incident with radioactive materials, not as much as the radioactive materials expert team within the Virginia Department of Health. They're going to be the ones that regulate, materials within a hospital and ensure that they have an emergency plan. They in Virginia, we have a couple of 2 or 3 teaching institutions that have a lot of research with radioactive materials and such, and they are all required to have a plan in place, which I'm sure many others are as well. How would you respond if there was a breach, if there was an incident involving radioactive materials? And that's part of, at the state level, the inspection and regulatory process to ensure that they have competent staff that could respond and report if there is an incident.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to comment on this?
Well, Laura, I think you talked about the different levels of radioactive material. We get millions, hundreds of millions of shipments through Amazon, UPS, different mail sources annually throughout the United States. And those are very low level. So when you go to like MERT training, they teach you, the different categories. But I think you're right. What Lee was saying is that you have good agencies that work together. You build these relationships before they're needed so that you can reach out. It's not just something that you're calling in a panic, but like you said, there are various levels of materials that are shipped, some high level, some low level, some very low level, but just working together with the agencies, like Lee said, having those relationships built is very valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as we continue the conversation, I think, Brian, what you just did is really identify what makes a good plan. What are those things that it needs to include? It's one thing to say we're going to collaborate, we're going to coordinate, we're going to bring people together, but what do we need to be talking about as we put those plans together? And how do we incentivize organizations to send people in this planning process, because it's always a drain on resources to just be doing planning when there is like more time sensitive, tactical things that need to be done on a day-to-day basis. I think one of the questions that kind of fits into that is like, how do local leaders communicate safety information on these topics to the public without introducing or creating unnecessary concern? How do we talk about our interest in preparing for an event that we think might be like high consequence, low probability? That these types of risk assessments are hard to communicate to the public, and I'd like to hear your experiences with that.
People are going to get tired of listening to me. So let's go back to Fusion, because we're really looking at that right now and how we're educating like the local health directors, the emergency managers. They're solid. They know how to communicate. But sometimes with the elected officials, I've attended the Board of Supervisor meetings and things like that. Put ourselves out there as public health, as the Virginia Department of Health. And I've pulled in some partners that I've known for many years from the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, making ourselves available to local officials, whether it's elected officials or local health directors or anyone who needs advice or help we've actually proofed briefs that they've had for the public to make sure that like the language is not alarming. How could it be softened but truthful? Because you have developers who really err sometimes on the side of let's not really put it out there what could happen, because we don't want to alarm the community. But then you don't want to go in with language from someone who really will cause, unintentionally, but will cause alarm and concern. So it's back to that communication, like Brian was talking about. You've got to build those relationships early.
Mhm.
And if there's turnover, we just had an election yesterday in Virginia, we're going to get a whole new administration. So you have to be able to talk to these folks at the local level, the state level, and really they depend on us to educate them on what could really happen and how could that impact the public, so they can frame that in such a way to discuss that with the communities and not cause that alarm. So I think it's, again, we're going back to communication, collaboration, and those relationships that we build across agencies, across local and state government, as well as our federal partners.
Yeah, I think you want to make sure and not go cheap on your public information officer for the county or city. You want to have somebody skilled in there, or maybe a consultant that can come in and make sure that the messaging is good. And one thing that Chief Cochran had mentioned about, again, when it comes to training, a lot of this is free. You can go back and get public information training. So if you don't have anyone in your municipality that handles public information, they can get that training, and at low cost or no cost at all through FEMA. So again, I think making sure you have somebody in place. So, and some of the things that we've responded to, the elected officials were united. They had a good public information officer, and they allowed the first responders to do their work and not convoluting, not going to the press unannounced, but kind of just keeping it all universally the same message going together as one.
Yeah, I think that everything, I've experienced and understand about communication is that you need to do it, before you need to do it. You need to establish the relationships, I think, are the key thing. And, to the extent possible, you have, something that you can put out right away, even if it's like, well, we don't know much right now, because the actual emergency may be slightly different than what you've modeled and exercises. So just having information out rapidly, and so it's the counter. So when there's not a lack of alignment amongst the people providing the messaging, that's that's not going to work. So it's a matter of hopefully you don't have an emergency right after this transition in elected officials or any other important positions, but you just need to get out. It's a high priority to do that, and it's, if you're going to be citing a facility, then that's probably one of the most important things to do before you cite it, is to make sure you understand how, because you're going to have questions from people about the citing of it. So use that as an opportunity to build a relationship so that people, know where to reach you at the coffee shop or wherever it is, and ask you questions. And there's going to be a whole variety of levels of concern, but having the information out quickly, I think, is paramount.
Yeah.
And if I could say for just a minute, as many of you know, I said earlier, we're in a very remote part of the state, but we're also a pretty small community. The county, roughly 4,800 square miles, but we have a population of a little over 12,000. And I think we're blessed in that area as far as communication because most everybody knows everybody personally. We work well with the local hospital. The city and county work amazing together. Most of the elected officials are a phone call away if you need something. The local EMS is amazing to work with. Our fire department is a volunteer, so they are members from the community. And to where some people might look at being remote and having those challenges as a disadvantage, I think it works well in ours as an advantage. Now, we still have state partners. We have connecting counties that are partners. I know with the emergency management position, we dealt directly with people in Wyoming as well as Utah because they bordered our county. Um, and we're small enough that we get to know each other. And even the community members, you get to know them. And I think that's a huge benefit for us here. And it's something that I would say most of us are very proud of, is to have those kind of relationships.
Yeah. And you've had public meetings, Chief Cochran, on consolidated storage and started to have these conversations. And can you describe that process a little bit? Because I think it's a good example of how to start these conversations early and what sort of reaction people have to these topics.
Certainly. And it was a great experience for me. The county and the city hosted this event at the courthouse. And predominantly was either department members from both agencies and as well as the elected officials. And we did have a couple of residents that attended the meeting. A lot of questions asked. This is something that's extremely new to most people in the area. We did with social media, there were a lot of comments that are negative. But again, only a couple of community members attended the session I went to. It was an all-day type with breakout sessions, but very informative. And I think it was put out there so that everybody had the opportunity to attend and ask questions. They were small groups, plenty of informative people in those groups. And I think we got a lot of questions answered. Does it clear up all of the confusion and maybe all of the concerns? Absolutely not. People can be extremely concerned when you're talking about that. Number one, I think some of it is not knowing what we're discussing, not knowing what they're looking at. And a lot of that was answered at those sessions. So it's been great being a part of it. It's been great seeing where it goes from this point. A lot of challenges for a small community, but nothing that I don't think we can overcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. From that perspective on, communicating on these topics and starting these conversations, Lee, I think it would be nice to kind of compare your experience in Virginia, since you guys have facilities and have been communicating or at least seeing how the utilities do it. What do you think works, and beyond longevity and just being there for a long time?
Right. I think it is community meetings, both from the fission side and now the fusion side. So there's a lot of community meetings and just helping everyone understand that there is a plan in place. You know, where do you go if you're evacuated? You know, Dominion has been very good, and VDH, Virginia Department of Health, and Department of Emergency Management follows up on their communication to residents around North Anna and Surrey power stations in Virginia. And the same thing will happen with fusion. Like, fusion and fission are totally different, and we know that in terms of level, but we still have to let the public know, regardless, you know, that we have a plan and what that plan could be. So early engagement, and as I believe Brian said, you know, doing this ahead of time, which is, I'm sure they did decades ago. Both North Anna and Surrey existed before I came almost 30 years ago. So, but with fusion, we're kind of adapting the same, you know, type of methodology, where we are engaging in the community meetings, answering questions, creating a website specific for people to go to. But it's just really key to let them know softly what could happen. But, you know, what would you do? Who would you reach out to if you have a concern? And so putting somebody out in the public to let them know that we're prepared to answer these questions has really worked well for Virginia up to this point. So,
Yeah. And Randall, how different is the Los Alamos audience? Because you've got folks there who often work in the industry as well, don't you? So you have a bit, maybe the conversations start at a different point?
Well, yeah, I guess in general, yes, but there's a people that don't work at laboratory that, you know, live here, and so it's more of a variety. But we'll get more kind of technical questions from people about, especially about the, you know, the safety of different things compared to might have in other communities. So, you know, we have, you know, of our population, not all the population works in laboratory, would work with radioactive materials, but there's a lot more familiarity with the issues and whether it's inherently safe or unsafe. I feel sometimes people might have less concern about it than maybe they should, but that's, you know, that familiarity works kind of both ways, right? So we do have, you know, and so that would be about any kind of topic. But yeah, there's, you know, different questions that we would be getting, or, you know, the department would be getting, or the facility would be getting from the public here than at other places.
Yeah. We had a question that kind of came in related to this topic, just in terms of some of the ways to talk about radiation dose and how to make this distinction, like Lee did, between fission and fusion, or consolidated storage, or transportation. Like these are not equivalent risks. And yet, when we talk about evacuation and emergency planning, I think people kind of think, okay, that means this is all dangerous to the same degree. And I'm interested in hearing from your experiences, what's effective? How much do you find it necessary to really dig into technical details to discuss radiation dose? How do you do that in trainings with first responders versus the public? Or is this a different challenge in terms of really looking at emergency planning through the lens of alignment first, and then the communication follows?
Yeah, I guess I'll try to answer this one. So it's an interesting question about the risk communication. So I think that when we're communicating, saying, well, this is the same dose you'd get if you ate a banana, which may not be actually true, right? You're comparing a dose associated with a voluntary act that is really nothing like
Mm.
the risk, right?
Yeah.
So it's the risk of different kinds of power generation. If you're looking at nuclear power, if we're looking at a defense nuclear site, we want to understand whether or not they're operating it safely and per the, you know, the requirements from DOE and from the Defense Nuclear Safety Board. So that, I think, is more important to my mind, to communicate to the public, let's communicate what they're doing. I mean, it can be helpful to some people, but I think in general, you wind up comparing, some sort of voluntary risk that they're taking to some other, an involuntary risk. It makes more sense to tell people, well, it's this the most dangerous part of your trip was driving to the airport. That I think makes sense to people. You know, so I think that's you have to come up with something equivalent. It's more difficult in the defense side because it's like you can compare that. Well, what if it was a different industry? What if we didn't have a defense facility here and we had an industry making, silicon chips? So I think that's what that makes it a better comparison for people in my mind.
Thanks. Any other comments on this topic? Brian, I'm interested in your experience, just thinking about the sort of relative risks and the communication piece of it. What do you think works best to bring people to the table to start doing this type of planning and motivate them to put the time and effort into getting those trainings and doing this work in advance?
Yeah, I think even though a lot of the training is for free through FEMA and other agencies, you still have to pay employees. If they're employees, you have to pay them time to travel and go do those things. But I think the communications portion is essential. I don't think there's anyone on this call, if they reached out to me through LinkedIn or whatever, wanted to ask personal questions, I'd certainly connect with them. I mentioned I'm in Carlsbad today. Yesterday, I went out and I met with the Eddy County Fire Department. I met with the sheriff. I met with the police department just to kind of compare notes a little bit. What are we doing? What are they doing? They work a lot with the WIP plant. They do training with them. So I was just trying to determine in my mind what they're doing correctly, what we could do better in my jurisdiction. So again, I think the communications part is key. But there again, I guess it depends on your personality. I'm the one that goes and knocks on the door of the sheriff's department here in town. I'm the one that will call people. I don't take a lot of no's. So I'm willing to reach out and put those meetings together. Certainly, when we have our multi-agency coordination center meetings in Las Vegas, we've got federal, state, and local agencies of all sorts there, nonprofit groups, really bringing them together so that when something does happen, we can use muscle memory and go in and respond. So again, I think, as we've said probably too much today, that forefront, getting the relationships early and built and the communication going, having some sample press releases ready to go to fill in the information. And as Randall said, say something. Don't just say no comment, but because that puts some fear in people. But just to say, look, we've got trained people in the area. We're doing this. We've contacted these agencies, and so we'll get you some more information. But things are well underway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's been my experience as well. I mean, the idea that we need to go through the exercise of knowing who is going to be under pressure to say something and have at least some first name recognition and be able to coordinate in real time. It's really important. Chief Cochran, I'm interested, you mentioned, the advantages of being remote and rural and everybody knowing each other. You also mentioned you have a volunteer fire department. When it comes to really helping motivate training for folks, how do you factor that in? How do you start those conversations?
I think that's, again, an advantage that we have. Those that are involved in the volunteer service, they're eager to learn things. We, in the city of Craig and surrounding Moffat County, we have a paid EMS, but in some of our outlying communities, we have a volunteer EMS. And those are people that are dedicated, want to learn more, they want to get more involved. And I think in general, the northwest corner of the state here, I would say we have some of the best partnerships I've seen, even coming from Georgia, the Atlanta area, because we rely on each other. We've learned from, we have tremendous wildfires in this area. And we have learned from those. We have tremendous snowstorms in this area. So we have learned from those. We've learned how to communicate. Um, and that helps out. It makes everybody want to know a little more. Challenges, we have obviously state partners that we work with. There is lots of state training offered here. But some of the challenges are we are 3.5 to 4 hours from Denver. That's quite a journey, especially in the winter months. So it's hard to get to those trainings if we can't do them remotely. We can't have them hosted here. But we've never had an issue with people wanting to be involved in those trainings. And we've been very fortunate in that area.
Yeah. I'm curious how you see things like wildfires and snowstorms with that experience that you have implementing emergency plans. How should people tuned into this who are looking at adapting their own emergency operations plans, what should they be thinking about to reflect new hazards and response protocols as you're doing right now when you think about it in relation to consolidated storage?
I think that we, again, with the small and rural community and so many people involved that work in the community, I would say combined, the city and county probably have the most employees in the community, whether it's volunteer, whether it's working for any of the governments here. Then you add in the hospital, huge employees. So everybody is either involved already or they have family that want to get involved in the best way they can. But I think with the planning and the anticipation that every year we're going to have a bad fire year, the community's already aware. We quite frequently go into fire restrictions early in the year. I think this past summer we had to go in quicker than usual. And people are aware. Our state partners, we have road signs that are VMBs, message boards that they publish that information that gets the information out quickly. If it's something urgent, we'll use the reverse 911 calling. We'll use our different applications that get information out to the public. But it's amazing how many people do want to be involved. They want to volunteer for any training or education they can get in communities like this. And I think that's what makes it work so well. I don't see it changing a lot if we do get a storage facility, because they're so accustomed to the summers with the fires and the winters with having to close down all the highways. So I think it's huge. Other partners, the school board, the school district, again, in a small community, you know everybody, and they're eager to change. They're either eager to train, they're eager to get involved in stuff. So huge benefits. So again, some people call them disadvantages. I always look at it as an advantage to be here.
Oh, thank you. Lee, in Virginia, I'm interested because you guys are probably going through that same process at looking at some of the existing tools that you're relying on for emergency operations, whether as the chief mentioned with message boards and reverse 911 calling. What other tools are you thinking about? Okay, how does this carry over?
So a carryover potentially from fission to fusion would be, for example, around fission, they actually, those two power stations put out response calendars every year. And they go to the potentially affected EPZ localities and has all of the information on it. If there is an emergency, this is a phone number you call. This is where your nearest evacuation center would be if there's an evacuation, and so on and so forth. The plan is likely to do the same with fusion, although again, much less likely that hopefully it would never be needed anywhere in Virginia, but less likely in Chesterfield around Fusion. But also, really putting out that information on a specific website around. And we'll take a step aside just for a moment, not just Fusion, but of course, we all know about SMRs coming on, and different areas of Virginia are looking at SMRs right now. So, so with the small modular reactor, that will be even a different type of implementation. So we'll take what already exists and the tools that we have and kind of adapt those, whether it is Fusion or SMR, and keep, things like a website up to date, a clear contact phone number, so people can get in touch. And I'm really the point person. And like Brian said, I've been the person out there knocking on the doors and, really engaging people. I bribe them at meetings with donuts, but, all kinds of things. But yeah, so, just really engaging. And I saw something pop up really quickly in the chat. Someone mentioned empowerment of like first responders, right? And I agree with that. And I think in Virginia that our training person has done a great job of that, really establishing those first responder relationships, empowering them, including them, treating them with respect, and the people keep coming back. They keep wanting to participate in the evaluated exercises and any additional trainings that we might offer. So again, not to keep bringing it up, but it's that line of communication and engagement with everyone that would be a part of that.
And I mean, you mentioned donuts. There's also, I mean, these are folks that are coming in and participating in a volunteer basis. Is it part of their jobs? Is it
Yeah.
are you getting it written into job descriptions for different organizations, or how are people?
So that's really, so two different groups. So if it's the first responders, no, it's just bribing them with food, and then they volunteer to do it. They're awesome. So, and it is not a part of their job. So they are paid first responders, but like, people can volunteer their time. And I think they probably get, time back or whatever, comp time. For this multi-agency group, it's interesting that you bring that up, because the conversation has been around, do we look at a different funding source potentially around multiple agencies? Right now, I do most of the legwork, and I am funded by the Virginia Department of Health, Office of Radiological Health. So it's not, I'm not funded by Commonwealth Fusion Systems or any outside entity. So I do a lot of the legwork to try to take that pressure off of those who have agreed thus far and have been very good to me, agreeing to be on my working committee. At some point, I think you do have to look at funding, in putting it in a job description. If people are going to be spending time, they need to be recognized for that. And it needs to, whether that's a financial thing or at least, for their resume in a job description. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that making folks aware of some of those constraints, we've talked in this conversation about some of the obstacles, and I think, Lee, thank you for kind of articulating that piece in terms of people's time and how to encourage volunteerism on these topics out of shared concern and common outcomes that people are trying to achieve. I'm curious, Brian, from the Nevada perspective, how you maintain interest there as well, because I think you'll have, how do you work, how does alignment come there? You mentioned the frequency of transportation. And so this is, again, one of those things that's been happening for a long time. And there's not it's, you're preparing for something that nobody expects to happen. It becomes old hat. How do you keep that interest in the topic?
Well, as has been mentioned, a lot of people are there because that's their job in these multi-agency coordination centers. But for years, I came as a volunteer. I was engaged. I wanted the training. I wanted some things to put on my resume. I wanted to kind of expand my circle of influence. So I think volunteers are a great way. But and again, as has been mentioned a couple of times, volunteers are very engaged. Again, I went back to the Emergency Management Institute many times without being paid, just to get that training, to get that networking, and it's kind of helped me in my career and in my foundation work. So again, and one thing that Lee mentioned, which I think is very important, is to if you do have volunteers in your community that are sacrificing their time and efforts, give them a little certificate, give them some praise, give them a little article in the newspaper about how they're the employee or the volunteer of the month or whatever it might be. Early on, based on my 1 October response, I was the National Emergency Management Volunteer of the Year in 2018. So that again motivated me to continue to give and continue to serve, and I felt those good feelings, so I didn't want to stop serving. And I think that's good, especially in smaller communities where you have lots of volunteers. But we have a ton of volunteers in Clark County, in Las Vegas area. So again, I think that's extremely important. But again, as you continue to train, and it becomes more normal to you to do the training, then when something does come up, it's not a shock to the system. You just put everybody in place, you get the EOC open, you get everybody their vests on, you go to work, you have the skilled people in place, and you go forward and do that. You know, I'd often heard, like, even with your families, if you expect power outages or things, go out in the backyard, have a little barbecue with your kids or grandkids every so often, so that when the power does go off, it doesn't seem that strange to them. And I think in the larger sense, when we're training together as a community, then when something does come along, it's not strange. We just go there, we get the work done, we accomplish it, and then we go back home. So I would say just keeping that group together.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, creating that community on these projects is important. And when we talk about alignment, that's essentially what we've done is we've created a community of folks that recognize each other and want to do things together. And as what lessons have we learned in building those types of relationships? What types of organizations do you find? We've talked about first responders, police, fire, EMS. These are some of the obvious. What are some of the less obvious partners that you've found in your respective communities that are interested, engaged on these topics?
Well, I actually engaged originally through the faith-based community. I was given an assignment to work with all of about 300 congregations in Nevada, helping them put together emergency response plans. I became, if you're familiar with VOAD, I became the state of Nevada chair of VOAD. And so there's a lot of nonprofit, non-government groups that engage quite a bit. They may not have financial resources, but they have volunteers that can come in. During the pandemic, we were training what they deemed as non-essential government employees to do other things, and we were training with them and delivering food and meals to doorsteps and things like that. So again, I think there's a lot of faith and community groups out there that are more than happy to engage.
Brian, can you clarify VOAD just for anybody who on the call might not be familiar?
Yeah, there's a national organization called Volunteer Organizations Active in Disasters. Probably every faith and community group on a national basis that responds belongs to that. And then they have state chapters also. So again, it would be churches, it would be the Red Cross, it would be United Way, it would be any little local groups that want to engage and help out. And you know, they came out of the woodwork during the 1 October. We had many organizations that wanted to help. So again, it's just having a liaison in place, which I was at the time for Clark County Fire, to take those groups and kind of channel in the efforts that we needed. You don't want it to be haphazard, but you want to be able to have the resources organized so they can come in and help.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I think there's also the factor of figuring out early in the process, whether it's sort of from the state or region, like pushing down for the local community to participate, or if it's a local community finding an issue that they're ready to organize on and kind of pushing out. I think in Craig, Colorado, I get the impression that you guys really organized locally first with interest in the consolidated storage project and have really then started to expand your circles of communication and engagement. Is that accurate?
I would say that's accurate, and how we got here has been a tremendous story as well. Our primary industry in the county and really the state is dwindling. We have coal plants here, coal mines, and we have one power plant that is coal fired. And those have started to diminish. We were losing those areas and researching an area of where we might replace those lost jobs. Um, so it has really grown. Started out as an idea when we found that the power plant was going to shut down. Um, there was talk of, well, do we want a nuclear plant? We have now have a large solar fields all around the county with solar energy. But how do we replace those in our community that are going to lose massive jobs? So this came out as a discussion. Originally, I think it was on the mind of people just being discussed. And then we had the talk session. And I think it's difficult a lot of times to get people involved. That comes back to the communication. Um, our city council, our mayor, our city staff, the county commissioners, the county staff are all good at trying to pull community into these conversations. We have state partnerships that are trying to help with the coal transition that are also out doing public campaigns about, hey, this is what we can offer. This is how we get people involved. So I think between the local governments, the coal industry, the power plants, the hospital, everybody knows somebody affected. And it helps bring all of those people in from everybody that knows it. And it gets you involved in talking, communicating. This is what our next steps are. Do we like this idea, or is this something we want to pass on? So I think we've just started cracking the door, and we'll have to see what comes around with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've all had experiences where public meetings are posted and promoted and the turnout is not necessarily what we hope for. And that is just the nature of these programs. Oftentimes figuring out what's the salient point that's going to really get people active on something is hard. And sometimes it's just impossible to get there until you're actually doing the work. And that's why I think this alignment question that we've been talking about is so important, because it starts to tap into what do people care about today? That's not something out in an abstract or distant future that will motivate them to want to participate in these conversations now. And figuring that out is important, because then it makes it hopefully less likely that they raise opposition in the future and say, I never heard about this or never knew about this. And that comes from one of the comments in the Q&A. And we're at a point in the conversation where if there are questions that people have in the audience, if you want to feel free to pop them into the chat, we can discuss some of those things as well. But I'm curious, from the perspectives on the call today, how have you seen public engagement in public meetings succeed or fail? Like what sort of lessons learned can we share with folks here to continue to do these, improve the outcomes from public meetings? Randall, I might push you on this because I know you referenced one earlier.
Yeah. Well, that was one, I think that was one that was, I guess it was successful, and there was a lot of people came. So there was well advertised, there was maybe not satisfaction with the results for some people, but I think that the department and the facility did a really good job of doing their best to explain the situation and how they were managing it, what they understood, what the risks were. It's always difficult communicating kind of worst case scenarios to people. I think that might be a lesson learned there, is that we present something that's really a worst case scenario. And I think at one point there was a comment made that, well, the dose could be 2 milligrams, but it's really 0, most likely. So maybe you lead with the most likely and try to bound that some other way than giving it a really specific number, because that's just what you calculated. So I think that's an interesting take on that. And I think then, so a fire is such a different kind of event, right? Wildfire, but it's what people in the West, we're very used to them now, all across the West, and the response to them. I think that's something that you can look at that process, how that's evolved to, because when we had the last fire here in 2022, just the availability of the teams, the incident teams, and their professionals at communicating was just so much better than when it was, like 20 odd years before that. So I think we can look at that. I think that was one of the things that Brian mentioned, but you can go learn from somebody else. And I think that in trying to explain, emergency preparedness, and it's good to look at, I think, where we had some success in that. So people were really quite satisfied with, they didn't like the fire, but they were quite satisfied with the information they were getting and the availability of it. And it was just that it was going to be regular. And during the day, obviously, we know they're working on fighting the fire. We're not expecting updates every 10 minutes, but they still managed to get updates fairly routinely. And so I think that was the other thing that I felt like was a really good lesson learned. I don't know if I want to bring up
I think
COVID
that's
response.
really,
but
uh,
just I
thanks,
was
Randall.
also thinking about the COVID response too, and because we were talking about what kinds of groups are engaged. I think your Chamber of Commerce and local businesses. I mean, the faith groups and other volunteer organizations. So going to Rotary or and talking to them, and that's part of that relationship building part. And they may have input for you that's worthwhile too. It's not always just information being provided, but you can hear things from the community too.
Yeah, thanks, Randall. I think you mentioned that the communication was much better during the wildfire season. And is that a function of organization, or are there new tools? Is this a resource issue that people should be thinking about? Because we've talked about having message boards and reverse 911 calling. Those are public investments in systems that do that sort of thing. What else
Right.
should folks planning right now be thinking about and asking for?
Well, some of the things, so we have Code Red here, which is just basically that emergency broadcast system. And that contacts cell phones and the few landlines that are left. But the other thing that we've been working on, which is more for the routine, is had some software that's helping us understand the social media postings, and also providing, I'd say, better content, because people in general don't want, it's great, we're all have the attention span to listen to this for an hour and a half. It's in the matter of seconds that people want to get a message. So it's having shorter videos out for the public, or even you can query and you want to hear about a topic, and they can type in part of what they want to hear about. So it's more on demand, which is what people are used to. So that can help with just preparedness in general. It's like, well, here's what you're supposed to do. It's even with the Ready, Set, Go system that I don't remember exactly what year it started, and it started different parts of the West. But that's something that I think in general people understand now. And so the more you have new people moving in, or you want to get reminded, but it's a fairly straightforward thing to communicate to people. And you can create then short videos. Here's what you need to do. You can go around people raking up leaves or getting, brush away from their properties. And it's a fairly easy thing to get information out about because it's a fairly straightforward system.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments from panelists on resources or tools that you would recommend communities consider for emergency planning purposes? Have we covered most of them? I know one thing that we had talked about were emergency operations centers and how those also serve to help align interests in real time in a response scenario. And what lessons have helped you improve operation centers over the years?
I actually took, there's a group of about 400 chaplains in Las Vegas, and they go to hospitals and prisons and things like that. But I am their emergency management director. So I actually had a training session with them. We went down and toured a fire station, and then we went upstairs and had our training in the EOC. And I borrowed the vests, and I gave each of the chaplains an assignment vest, and we did some scenarios. And so I think it kind of brought to realism for them what goes on in the EOC. I did it kind of selfishly in case I ever needed any of them to come in and help me. They were already be familiar with that situation. So I do some training for them, but I think that helped the EOC. And there was a comment earlier about have there been any tribal successes? You know, the tribal communities in Las Vegas and Nevada are certainly part of our EOC, and making sure that their input is valued and that sort of thing. So again, I think bringing people in, making them comfortable like I did on a selfish way, getting chaplains ready in case I needed to bring somebody else in to help support the EOC.
That's great. Lee, and Virginia, what does your EOC setup look like?
In Virginia, our EOC is located at a state police headquarters, and over the years, it certainly has grown. So, I think earlier we were talking about groups that we wouldn't have realized that we would have worked with, but like Virginia agriculture, transportation certainly, public safety certainly, but other things like social services and agriculture have been added over the years, as well as rotating the people who are training, right? So we don't just do our annual FEMA evaluated exercise and jump into the EOC for that one day, dress rehearsal, really 2 days, and then the exercise, but throughout the year. And that allows opportunity for all of these groups to be able to rotate different people through the EOC. How does it operate? What does it look like? What kind of information comes through there, and how is that disseminated? So I think, going back to looking at those who participate in this preparedness and actually growing that group. Like Brian said, he did that selfishly to bring in some of these chaplains, but you bring in additional people who can bring something to the table and can learn to do that. We all know we have to have shifts if there's an actual emergency. So it helps grow those groups. Additionally, identifying these individuals early and getting them access to the EOC with a badge instead of having to be bogged down trying to get entrance has been very helpful in terms of, our timing on response. And that's across all groups, not just the RAD group, and getting into the EOC and getting set up quickly. And it's because of the identification of the different partners we may or may not need, depending on the emergency, but making sure that they all have access to the EOC and that they're familiar with it.
Yeah. Randall, you've had some issues with EOC access too, haven't you? Actually, you and Chief Cochran probably both do for very different reasons.
Oh yeah, so we have the laboratory has an emergency operations center that was built after the 2000 fire, and that has been very useful. However, there's been a couple issues with it. First of all, when we had the fire in 2022, and I was the chair of the council, I couldn't easily get into it since I didn't have a badge. So most of the people that are there are, they're going to be more our fire department. And so the fire department that we have in the county is actually under a cooperative agreement with the DOE, and they all have badges. So everybody that's with the fire department has a badge, but the elected officials don't necessarily have access to the EOC. I was able to go in basically when the fire was done and look around a little bit when there were just a few people left. So we recognized that kind of as an issue, and it was part of the rationale for having the county have a project to have a regional emergency operations center. So this would also be something that we have a number of Pueblos, Native Americans, tribes in the area. So we do other collaboration with them, but this would be another aspect of collaboration, on incidents that happen on different parties' properties and can help respond to that, because the one that's overfunded by DOE, it would not likely be available for general incidents in the area. So that would be a benefit to us. And I think there's been questions that come up about funding for all this. So we're very lucky here in having that agreement with the DOE to help us fund our fire department. And you're relying on volunteers, then that's a whole volunteer management thing. But it's hard to coordinate volunteers without some kind of professional person doing it, and making sure they have the training that they need and they're available as needed. But yeah, there's quite a bit of funding needed to have an EOC, and then it's available then once you have it, that you can do some of that training that's been discussed. So it can be training, not just for us in the county, but for us in the region, because as I said, we're a fairly small county, and we're highly dependent upon the region for most everything.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Chief Cochran, in Craig, Colorado, you've talked about this sort of expansive space you have and the distance people have to travel to get anywhere. How does that influence what an emergency operations center would look like, or how it would operate in a more rural context?
Well, I can tell you for our Emergency Operations Center, we have a public safety building. And that public safety building many years ago was designed by the county, the city, and the state patrol. So in our building, we house the police department, the sheriff's department, the detention facility, the state patrol local barracks, as well as the communications center that's run by the state patrol. And in that building that we all have access to is our EOC room. Much smaller than some of our other panelists on here. Not a lot of seating, but obviously we have all the functions available there. It has been activated, believe it or not, very few times, simply because our wildfires wind up being a national incident management team that comes in for those. We've activated it for, obviously during COVID, we activated a lot for winter storms. Especially when we have roads and highways that shut down. But locally in the city here, most people can make it into the center. So we coordinate transportation. I think a couple of years ago when we had a pretty bad or significant snowstorm, we had children stranded at the school. So that includes road and bridge, getting people in to clear the roads for us. You coordinate with the school system, and it works well for us here, extremely well.
Yeah, that's great. And then we got prompted here. Can you talk a bit about the hazmat book and how spent fuel is defined there?
So I can talk about the hazmat book. We call it the ERG, Emergency Response Guide. I'm sure everybody on the panel is aware of those. Long time ago, we referred to it as the Orange Book. And that's what every first responder carried in their vehicles. Today, it has grown to much more. A lot of it is web-based. You can have the app on your phone. And most of the hazards that travel on our highways or railways, many times on buildings that have hazardous materials, whether it doesn't matter what it is, they have a number on it. And you reflect that number in your book to get specific information on those items. What made it nice when we became a digital age is being able to have your cell phone and quickly look up that number rather than having to thumb through all the pages. But we've all used those at time. Could I specifically quote what it talks about the spent nuclear fuel? No, I've never had to look that one up, but huge resource. Very nice that now it's digital.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. No, that's great. There's another question from the chat that I wanted to address because we've talked a lot about volunteerism and really looking at how to recruit and retain people's interest in this preparation work. Is that a sign that there need to be more professionals in the emergency management realm? Should we be looking at this as a workforce issue as well? Because I know when we talk about the nuclear industry at large, we're working on workforce in a lot of different ways. Do you feel like is this another aspect to be discussing in terms of recruitment, resources, career planning for different organizations, another way to connect with folks?
I'll take a stab at it.
Please do.
I don't think anybody on the panel would say that, oh, we don't need more people in the profession, any of our professions. We're always looking for more. But quite frankly, volunteers are going to help with that. We rely on them. I don't think we could ever have enough people to handle everything alone. We have heard talks about the faith-based. That's a great thing here is we have a ministerial alliance that all of the nonprofits and most of the first responder organizations participate in once a month. And that helps get the word out a lot. Do we need to prepare for the future with training for our youth as they're coming out of high school and college? Absolutely. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But I don't think we will ever get to a point to where we don't need those volunteer organizations, those nonprofit organizations that we partner with. And give you a wonderful example that came out of a tragedy that we had earlier this year. Again, small community, but we had in our apartment complex, local complex, one of the buildings caught on fire. And many families displaced. The Red Cross responded from Grand Junction, which is again 2.5 hours on a good day drive to get here. But with the other nonprofits in the area that we had, including organizations that sometimes we don't think about, and that's Boys and Girls Club. They were set up to be our temporary housing location. We had the school system offering temporary housing in one of their gyms. And within hours of this fire, we had so many donations of everything from food to water to people offering places for the victims to stay. Thank goodness nobody was hurt in this fire. But that's where your volunteers come in. That's where these other organizations come in. That's where the churches and the faith-based community were offering meals for these people. Absolutely amazing. We continually do school recruiting. Even in my profession as law enforcement, knowing that most of your recent graduates from high school don't even qualify to be in this profession. But we do job fairs at these locations to get them aware of it. Because being in a remote place, we have problems getting employees anyway. So we start out early to try to interest in the field. And that's in general with EMS, with fire, with any of our local businesses. But I don't think we will ever be to a point that we don't need our volunteers. We don't need our nonprofits to partner with.
I really appreciate this perspective because it reframes volunteerism. It's not because we need free labor, it's because this is a signal of a functioning society in a lot of ways where people are trying to help each other, which I think is a really nice sentiment to kind of wrap this up, our conversation today. I think this has been really helpful, and I hope it's been useful for our audience. I think that, in terms of some of the message boards and reverse 911 calls and the different types of software that's being used to facilitate communication and monitor social media to understand, to like that, those are the type of things that people are trying to do that resource planning now, in addition to planning for resources in terms of the human resources that are necessary to do this stuff well, and really building, helping people figure out how to, this participation builds their resume or creates a circle of influence for their careers and motivates them in those various ways. You guys have mentioned these things that I think are really useful. We've got a nice list of other organizations and other parties to engage, and I'm seeing a new fact sheet come together from some of the things that you guys have talked about today. So I really appreciate your participation. I think it's really interesting because there's a difference between public meetings that are reactive or proactive in terms of what brings people to have these discussions. And so I want to thank all of our panelists today and all of the folks who tuned in, because I think we've demonstrated that we have a proactive approach on these topics and are able to have these conversations to really start to think through so that we are prepared for the unexpected, and the likelihood that those things tip into a crisis is much lower when we've got people having these kinds of conversations. I'll give the last word to any of our panelists if there's anything I've left out. Otherwise, I will wrap up here and thank everybody for your time and attention. Tune into the ECA YouTube channel to rewatch this if you want to, and feel free to reach out if you want to continue these conversations with us. Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you
a great
for
day.
attending.